This is the last video in a series on the Great Elvish Empire on the world of Tyria. If this is your first exploration into the Great Elvish Empire, you might want to go to the first video and the beginning of this story. Please like, share, and subscribe as it helps the channel, and thank you for watching. Hello, and welcome to the world of Tyria. Tyria is a world where the events of the past rise to haunt, sometimes literally, the people of the present. So in order to fully understand the peoples and events of today, we must look backward to the people and events that set the stage for the present. In this series of videos, we will explore the Great Elvish Empire, its rise, achievements, and its tragic fall, and the impact this Tyria-spanning empire still has on people thousands of years after its end. Part 3. The Death of the Dream. The fall of the Great Elvish Empire. In order to understand the War of Hawks and Serpents, we must first turn to another major war that occurred shortly before, and that is the Great Asheri War. The Asheri Empire is a vast empire of arid plains and deserts dotted with city-states built around ziggurats that is situated east of the Elvish imperial heartlands on the west coast of the continent of Alberus, with the dwarvish kingdoms of the Dwarf Crown, Northern Iron Wall, and Southern Iron Wall mountains in between the two empires. The Asheri Empire and the Great Elvish Empire have been enemies for millennia, with skirmishes and small wars occurring on the borders, but this erupted in a massive multi-front attack by the Asheri with their human, undead, and fiend troops on the dwarvish kingdoms as well as the Great Elvish Empire. The dwarfs managed to keep the Asheri out of their underground holdings, but the Asheri managed to punch through the Elvish border north of the Dwarf's Crown Mountains, the Dwarf Gate, which is a gap between the Dwarf's Crown and North Iron Wall Mountains, the Shadow Gap, which is the gap between the North and South Iron Walls, and the Yushuri Plains south of the Iron Wall Mountains. These armies overran the border defenses and pushed into the provinces of the Heartlands, killing everyone in their path, with the Asheri black sorcerers and priests followed behind the armies, animating the dead to provide additional troops to the army. Panic swept the empire as the military gathered troops from all over the empire to stop the invasion, while local troops, magic users, seekers from the way of the White Tree, and the priests of the gods of the non-elves made untold stands against the Asheri horde in order to stop or at least slow down the invaders. Not everything was going the way of the Asheri though. The Elvish air fleet soon came into the war, and with the Asheri having little or no air assets, the air fleet was able to bombard the Asheri armies almost with impunity, and now that the dwarves have stabilized their borders, directly attack the Asheri invaders from their entrances on the Elvish side of the mountains, their firearms and cannon causing great damage to the Asheri despite their overwhelming numbers of undead. The death blow to the invasion came when an Elvish general, who is now called the Nameless One, took command of the forces south of the Southern Iron Wall Mountains and was able to organize and coordinate the various forces, and in a masterful campaign drove the Asheri from the Yushuri Plains and back across the border. He then moved from front to front, throwing back the Asheri forces from the empire and breaking the siege of the Asheri on the dwarfs on the Asheri side of the mountains. He then marched into the Asheri Empire and destroyed the settlements along the border to provide a buffer zone, and then marched home, where he was hailed as the greatest military commander in the history of the empire. This war had many effects on the empire, but the greatest was the change in the empire's mindset. After the war, the empire became more defensively oriented, with some calling it paranoid. The Shadow Gap and the Dwarf's Gate had fortifications and walls built with a large garrison manning them. Every province bordering the Asheri Empire had their borderlands 100 miles deep confiscated by the empire and turned into military provinces, ruled not by governors chosen by the inhabitants' traditions, but by generals dispatched by the imperial high command. And the research that had made the life of the peoples of the empire better are now turned towards weapons development. In all levels of society, the thought that this can never be allowed to happen again became prevalent, and the empire slowly became more militant. The Nameless One returned to Luminara to be honored with a massive military parade composed of every people who participated in the defense of the Empire. At the end, the Emperor awarded the highest military honors to the commanders and awarded the Nameless One the highest honor, a seat in the upper house of the Imperial Council, with his domain being the military provinces now being formed. Only a dozen elves who did not descend from the original elf kings were given a seat in the upper house, and never to a military commander, and the Nameless One accepted to the cheers of everyone present. The first order of business of the upper house was to reward the heroes of the Great Asheri War, and the Nameless One was at the forefront of this push as he fought with these people and had a great respect for them. First, the Empire shared some of their engineering secrets with the dwarfs for their part in the war. Many were confirmed into governorships of the provinces of their people after consultations with the survivors in those provinces, and lands and homes and wealth were handed out as well, all with the endorsement of the Emperor. Then one of the members suggested that since the non-elves fought so furiously and heroically in defense of the Empire that they deserve their own seats in the upper house. At this a furious debate arose. Half of the house, joined by the Nameless One, argued that the non-elves should and would be given every honor and reward. It was the elves' long lifespan that guided the Empire into the greatness it enjoyed, and the non-elves' shorter lifespans would not allow them to appreciate their carefully laid plans, and that it had been tradition since the founding that the upper house was composed of elves. The other half of the house argues that the time for long-term planning ended with the Great Asheri War, and that it was that focus on long-term planning instead of focusing on the here and now that allowed the Asheri to invade the Empire in the first place, and they pointed out the tradition of elves who descended from the old kings was broken 13 times in imperial history, with the Nameless One being the latest one. The debate lasted for weeks until a vote was called for and the house was evenly divided. The Emperor broke the tie by voting for inclusions with the following changes, which was his right to make. The first change was that the first to be considered for inclusion would be from those non-elves given the highest honors after the war, and the second change was that the house was to research and come up with a method of selecting an upper house member from every province in the Empire, and this plan was to be implemented in 10 years. The Nameless One, being unused to both politics and defeat, took his leave of the upper house and toured the military provinces to inspect their progress and receive personal reports from his generals on the actions of the Asheri on the border. It was during this tour the Nameless One informed the generals of the decisions of the upper house, and many generals and their staffs also voiced their opposition to the decision. It would seem at this time the Nameless One was going to be the nucleus of an opposition party in the upper house, and it would have remained this way if it were not for the actions of the Emperor's daughter and heir Elathra. Elathra was the eldest daughter of the Emperor and his chosen heir. In court she met and fell in love with Aulus Caninius Brucetus, a human administrator. Eventually they could wait no longer, and they snuck out of the palace complex and found a friendly seeker who married them. Soon after, Elathra became pregnant. She went on a progress to inspect the Empire at this time in order to hide her pregnancy, and none of her household breathed a word to the Emperor about the pregnancy, but eventually the heir gave birth to a healthy half-elf boy named Aulus after his father, and then the Emperor learned of his grandson and recalled his daughter to the capital. The Emperor was ready to remove her as heir and banish Aulus when it was discovered they were legally married. The Emperor had no issue with his grandson being a half-elf. Unions between elves and humans held no stigma, and half-elves were not uncommon, but he was angered this was done by the heir behind his back. He forgave his daughter and had an idea. He knew the inclusion of non-elves into the upper house has caused division, and he saw his grandson as the natural union between elves and non-elves, and made a change to the order of succession. He placed his infant grandson ahead of his daughter as heir to the alabaster throne. Since young Aulus would have a shorter lifespan than his mother, she would still take the throne on his death. This was well within the emperor's rights, if not in keeping with tradition, and the upper house accepted the change, except for the Nameless One. When the news of the change reached him, he was enraged. He had fought for an empire of stability and tradition, and the emperor was, in his eyes, destroying everything he has fought to preserve, and he varied between rage and despair. It was in this state that the Asheri slipped an agent into the Nameless One's headquarters to speak with him. The agent managed to keep the Nameless One from killing him and made a proposal. The Asheri had learned their lesson in attacking the empire and wished peace, but that could not be with the current emperor on the throne. If the Nameless One were to overthrow the emperor, they would provide their support, and when the emperor was gone, the Asheri would sign a perpetual peace treaty with the empire. All the Asheri would ask for is some of the empire's magical research in order to aid the development of their own magic. The Nameless One was skeptical of how much assistance the Asheri could offer since they had just lost a war, but the agent invited him to visit his partner to see what kind of assistance could be offered. Intrigued, the Nameless One and the agent snuck out of the headquarters and into the forest, where they met the Asheri partner, Gizmek, a pit fiend from the 9 hells. Shifting into the form of an elf, he offered a deal to the Nameless One. Gizmek's lord has given him the command of one of the 9 hells armies, and he could bring them to Tyria, and with them, the Asheri's undead, and those troops the Nameless One could trust. They could force their way to Luminara and depose the emperor and his family, and the Nameless One could take the throne and begin the second dynasty of the empire without the threat of war from the Asheri, and the status quo restored. He pointed out that he was not asking for his soul. The 9 hells was concerned that the chaos would attract the attention of the abyss, and they could not have that. They only require that in order to seal the pact he needed to make a blood sacrifice of Elathra, Aulus, and the infant heir of the empire. The Nameless One was taken aback. He had killed in war, and he realized the rebellion would cost more lives, but to murder a child and his parents went against everything he was, but he also saw the empire dissolving into chaos. Being a soldier his entire long life, he chose to sacrifice his morals for the good of the empire, and with a shaking voice he agreed. In the days after the meeting, the Nameless One used his connections to track the movements of the heir and his parents, and when the time was right, pt3 swept in, killing their bodyguard and attendants, and abducted their targets. While the Imperial Guard and their wizards were frantically searching for the heir and his parents, the Nameless One sacrificed them all on an altar in the presence of fiends and the Asheri, condemning him for all time. Gizmek then raised the parents as juju zombies to act as his bodyguards and minders. The Nameless One then gave the order to his subordinates to begin the rebellion. Disguised troops used travel gates to infiltrate key military, civilian, and research sites to take them over. Due to the element of surprise, some were taken, but some were able to repulse the ambushes. During these attacks, the Nameless One issued a proclamation declaring that due to his actions, the emperor is no longer the legitimate ruler of the empire, and called on the governors and the Imperial Council to aid him in overthrowing the emperor. Border troops loyal to the Nameless One allowed the Asheri into the empire, and gates opened and the pt3 army poured out, and some of the Elvish governors declared their support for the rebellion, but many others resisted. Many of the border generals stayed loyal and repulsed the Asheri, and the non-Elvish troops mostly stayed loyal to the emperor. The War of Hawks and Serpents has begun. Historical note: the War of Hawks and Serpents is named so because the emblem of the Great Elvish Empire was the hawk, and the emblem of the Nameless One was a winged serpent. Throughout the empire everyone chose sides. The Imperial Navy overwhelmingly stayed loyal to the empire, as did the air fleet, with those who sided with the Nameless One fleeing into the oceans and wild space to disrupt transport and trade. The upper house and the majority of the lower house also stayed loyal, with those in the lower house who sided with the Nameless One escaping Luminara, but some were captured and imprisoned. Some of the members of the Imperial Conclave of Magic went over to the Nameless One, but the institution itself remained loyal. The Imperial Army was more evenly split, with most of the non-Elvish troops being loyal to the Empire, but some, who were personally loyal to the Nameless One, did side with him, and the majority of the researchers stayed with the Empire. The opening moves in the war were ones of stabilization. The Nameless One secured the border areas under his control to bring in his Asheri allies and push into the Empire. At this time the Nameless One kept imperial institutions in the areas he had taken going, and non-Elvish officials were left in place, with the only difference was a military presence in these areas. He made sure to keep the pt3 on the front lines to avoid uprisings in the rear, and the Asheri undead were moved at night to the front lines for the same reason. He strengthened the isolated areas under his control to withstand a siege in order to draw away imperial forces from the front, and began to gather resources to begin an offensive to push to Luminara. The first thing the Empire did was to disable their travel gate networks to hamper further infiltrations. I say hamper because an active travel gate can be used to reach an inactive gate, but it is very dangerous. Doing so incurs a risk that the active gate will instead send the user to one of Tyria's pseudo-planes of the Shadowlands, Fairy, or the Spirit World. There is even a small chance that the active gate will suffer fatal feedback and detonate, causing absolute destruction in a vast area. Because there is a chance the Nameless One can still travel to the inactive gates, troops were still garrisoned at the gates to prevent any incursion. The Empire then began to gather and send troops to the front, but this is harder than in the Asheri War due to the loss of the travel gates and the fact the rebellion was occurring all over the Empire. The Imperial military began to recruit the citizens from local areas to make good the shortfall, using the air fleet to move them and thus preventing their use in offensive operations. The first battles in the Heartlands occurred in the far north and south, with an offensive by the Nameless One to achieve two objectives. First, the push in the north was to take the northern provinces and threaten the island of Skivra, which was home base for the navy and air fleet in this part of the Empire, and hopefully take the island and remove them from the war. The second objective was a push from the south to threaten Luminara and frighten the Emperor into abdicating. These offensives were proceeding well, with the undead troops being used to soften up the Imperial troops and reactivating captured travel gates to bring in reinforcements and supplies as they went, and the Emperor was considering abdication in order to spare the Empire until he received intelligence on what happened to his daughter, son-in-law, and grandson. He then ordered the use of the weapons developed after the Asheri War. Along and behind the Nameless One's lines, bursts of energy from the planes of radiance, fire, and the positive material plane bloomed, causing destruction not seen since the war between the giants and dragons in the mythic past. Undead troops were annihilated by the positive energy. Captured cities and towns were turned into slag heaps by the energy from the plane of fire, and the energy from the plane of radiance blinded, then caused the rebel troops to combust spontaneously, leaving nothing but ash. This attack brought the offensives to a swift halt, and the Imperial troops were able to retake some territory, but the rebels were not broken, and they stabilized their lines, and they and their pt3 allies went to work developing their own weapons. After this attack, the front lines remained in this near stalemate for 200 years, with a decade of inactivity punctuated by years of savage conflict, and while one side of another would take this town or that patch of ground, there was no breakthrough on either side. Eventually, other nations and empires aided in the war on one side or the other and used the excuse of the war to settle scores with one another, and mercenaries from wild space came to Tyria to ply their trade for both sides. As the war dragged on, society on both sides began to break down. Recruitment turned to conscription. There was a shortage of magic users in the rear as they had been sent to the front, so the conveniences the people had relied on for generations began to break down. The schools, except for the magical schools and universities, shut down as everyone was needed for war work, including the children. Civilian spelljammers left Tyria never to return, and the spelljamming ports became ghost towns unless They were used by the air fleet, and trade came to a standstill, with the paper elant becoming less and less valuable until governors were forced to mint their own coins from precious metals to keep a modicum of an economy going in their territories. On the rebel side, it was worse. In the beginning, the Nameless One treated the non-elves as full citizens who were simply under martial law, and he attempted to sway them to his cause, but as the war drug on and his attitudes became more hardened. Some believe this was due to the subtle influence of his pt3 allies. The non-elves became more like second-class citizens and eventually slaves fit only to fuel war production and to be sent in as cannon fodder on the front. Many uprisings took place that were put down brutally by the pt3, and their corpses were animated and sent to the front. The rebels also adopted the Asheri practice of forcing people to hand over their dead to be animated as undead soldiers, except for the elves, who were exempt. Neither side realized what they were fighting for had already been destroyed. Now all they cared about was destroying their enemies. The Nameless One slowly became more and more desperate as the war dragged on, and his supplies and manpower became more and more stretched, until one of his researchers came across some records from when the Heartstones were developed, and an accident occurred that caused great destruction and warped magic, the weather, and living things in the area of effect. The Nameless One saw this as the way to create a breakthrough in the lines, but the one who destroyed the Heartstone would die, and he asked for a volunteer, and one of his wizards stepped forward. He then set to planning the attack. The rebels took a captured Heartstone and attached it to the wellspring of power in a province they were contesting. He then removed the undead and fiend troops from the province, as they would be destroyed or banished from the warped magic. The Empire misinterpreted this as moving troops to begin another offensive elsewhere, and moved troops to the north to blunt the perceived threat. On the day of the blast, the rebels retreated into physical and magical shelters to wait out the magical storms as the volunteer destroyed the Heartstone. The volunteer was disintegrated as a massive blast shook the earth for hundreds of miles around, and what appeared to be a second sunrise appearing in the west to observers outside of the area. The rebels waited for a few days in their shelters for the worst of the wizard weather to calm down, and began the attack. The Imperial troops, who had caught the brunt of the wizard weather, bereft of all of their magical devices, and suffering from attacks from wild-shaped creatures, were no match for the rebel troops, who were trained to fight without the aid of magic, and the Imperial survivors were overwhelmed, and a great hole opened in their lines, and the rebel armies poured through like water from a breached dam, and the rebels began their push to Luminara. To keep reinforcements from plugging the breach, a general attack was also launched along the front as a distraction, but when word came to these troops that a major breach occurred in the lines to the south, entire units deserted to try to reach their families and get them to safety, and the distractions became breaches in their own right, and in every part of the Heartlands rebel banners were seen. At this time the dwarfs, seeing the need to save their own people, withdrew from the war and sealed their doors, protecting their people and leaving the elves to their fate, much to their shame. This only bought the dwarfs some time, and the Asheri undead managed to make their way into the underground kingdoms and slaughtered tens of thousands of dwarfs, leaving their halls haunted and lifeless, with the survivors fleeing to the surface, but this will be covered in more detail in another video. The breakthrough brought a total collapse of Imperial society. Many Imperial officials abandoned their posts, causing a breakdown in law and order, and the cities and towns were looted by the people before they fled. The Heartstones were stolen to power the refuges of the wealthy refugees, and some of these Heartstones exploded, causing the same chaos as the Nameless One caused. The towns and cities, now bereft of their infrastructure that allowed them to function, and they were quickly abandoned, and the roads were choked with deserting troops, refugees, and those who preyed on them, and all the while the rebels advanced. The only city still functioning was the city of Luminara, and they were swiftly preparing for a siege. The air fleet was called to Luminara to aid in the defense and evacuate citizens, the order was given to reactivate some of the travel gates to bring in whatever troops that were still at their posts and to aid in the evacuation of the people. And the magical defenses of the city were activated, and the city waited for the inevitable siege. The call was then sent out to the imperial troops around Tyria, who were still fighting in good order, to abandon their positions and make their way to the heartlands and launch a counter-attack against the rebels. The Empire was willing to, at least temporarily, give up their overseas empire in order to save the heartlands. The rebels then reached the city of Luminara and after launching several attacks to try to breach the defenses, settled in for a siege. Luminara held out with the hope that the armies from the rest of the empire will be coming to lift the siege, but as the messages to return to the heartlands were not acknowledged or refused, the city became more and more fatalistic, and eventually some of the gate guards, in an attempt to save themselves and their families, contacted the rebels and offered to open the gates, and the rebels accepted. At dawn the defenses were let down and the death of Luminara began. For most of the day the rebels slaughtered everyone they could find as they battled their way to the palace complex. At the docks and the travel gate complex were mobbed as the people sought any way to escape, and the gate operators and spelljammer captains got as many people out as they could while the garrison kept the rebels away for as long as possible. During this time the emperor, knowing the end was near, awaited the rebels in the throne room with the Ring of One Wish acquired from the Arcanes so long ago. The rebels finally fought their way to the palace complex and forced their way in, killing the Imperial Guard to a man and woman. The Nameless One felt his moment of triumph arriving when he was told by prisoners the Emperor was in the throne room, and he went there to either take him prisoner or kill him and sit on the throne he now felt entitled to, not realizing the throne had no meaning anymore. The Nameless One and his Juju zombie bodyguards entered the throne room and demanded the Emperor surrender to him, seeing his daughter and son-in-law as Juju zombies broke the last part of him, and he used the ring. He rose from the throne and in a booming voice roared, "I wish you to be damned to eternal darkness and your name forgotten." At that moment the shadows of the late afternoon city flowed like water towards the palace complex and covered every inch of it. Every single living being in the city felt a sense of overwhelming dread that stopped all fighting, and when the shadows dissipated the palace complex was completely gone, replaced by a plaza of seamless white stone. When the rebels attempted to use magical communicators to reach their leader, they could not because they could not remember his name, and in later ages when people came upon books or monuments detailing the Nameless One, his name had disappeared as if it had never been written or carved. After the fall of the Empire, several attempts were made to locate the palace complex by adventurers. The few that have returned report the palace now resides in the Shadowlands with a gloomy and haunted copy of Luminara surrounding it. The Nameless One has been spotted, possibly kept alive through the nature of the Shadowlands or the Emperor's wish, but the Emperor has not been seen and his fate is unknown. Through magic and mundane messengers, the news of the disappearance of the Nameless One, the Emperor, and the palace complex was spread, and in collective shock, the fighting stopped. The Bartezu armies were recalled to the Nine Hells, and the Asheri armies withdrew with their stolen Elvish research. The elves would have a form of revenge against the Asheri, as it was their flawed understanding of this magic that brought down their empire a century later. Both sides of the war withdrew and found defensible positions to try to rebuild, and the rebel elves became warlords, terrorizing everyone nearby with their raids and murders. It was at this time the gods of the elves returned to their wayward children and retaught them the lessons they had taught their ancestors so long ago, and this time the people listened and the elves began to rediscover the traditional elvish ways, casting aside the magitech that had brought about so much destruction. This did not come without a cost, as the gods stripped the elves of their normal birth rate, so now the people would have far fewer children than during the Empire. The elves and the other races would try to re-establish realms as a dark age settled on the old lands of the Empire. The dream of the elves, of peace, prosperity, and advancement for all peoples was dead, and a new, more dangerous reality took its place. Thank you for watching our history of the Great Elvish Empire. If you can, please consider donating to the channel on our Patreon or our PayPal. Links to both are in the description. Thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next video.